They are not one of his sheep, for whom he lays down his life, will lay down his life, and therefore they do not believe. He doesn't say, you are not my sheep because you do not believe. He says, you do not believe because you are not of my sheep. While in contrast, verse 27, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. Now, in these verses, we really have the core of what are often called the doctrines of grace. We have divine election. We have those who are referred to as his sheep, and some of them described as his sheep in this way even before they were born. They are his sheep that the Father has given to him by divine election in the eternal counsel of redemption. We also have the effectual calling of those who are his sheep. My sheep hear my voice and follow me. I have other sheep who have not yet come to me. They too will hear my voice, and they will follow me. But then we also have reference here to what is sometimes called limited atonement or particular redemption. Those given to Christ as his sheep are those who in due time will effectually hear his voice in the gospel and come to him, and it is specifically these sheep for whom he lays down his life. I lay down my life for the sheep. You do not believe because you are not of my sheep, but my sheep, both those believing in me now and those not yet converted among the Gentiles or even not yet born, they also will hear my voice and they will believe, and it is specifically the sheep for whom I lay down my life. Now, why do I begin this evening with this passage? Well, as most of you know, we've been involved now for some time in a series of messages on the subject of the cross. In fact, there have been 16 messages in this series thus far. Don't throw stones at me. 16 messages, believe it or not. But there is still at least one last loose end, and that's always been a problem that I have. I don't like loose ends, and maybe that's why I preach long series of sermons. I don't know, but there is still one last loose end that needs to be tied up before we conclude this series. And it has to do with the question, for whom did Christ die? Now let me briefly review the scriptural terrain that we've already covered in our study. I remind you that after seeking to demonstrate the centrality of the cross in Scripture and in God's plan of salvation, we began by spending a couple of messages focusing on the larger biblical setting of the cross. For example, we considered the connection of the cross to the eternal covenant of redemption, or counsel of redemption, and to our federal union with Christ in the mind and electing purpose of God from eternity. That was way back at the beginning. We also considered the cross in its connection to the priesthood of Christ. And then we dug down into the very heart of the atonement itself, asking the question, according to the Bible, what exactly was happening when Jesus died on the cross. And we saw that Christ was offering up himself as a substitutionary, curse-bearing sacrifice for sin. After this, we began to consider the achievements of the cross, or what the cross accomplished, its results, its effects: propitiation, reconciliation, redemption, the vindication of God, and then lastly, what we just recently finished, victory. Victory over Satan and the establishment of God's kingdom. But now we come to the question, for whom was all of this accomplished? For whom did Christ act as a substitute? And for whom did he propitiate the wrath of God on the cross? Who did he reconcile to God by his death and actually redeem by his blood? Who did he rescue from the power of the devil by his death? For whom did Christ die? Now, sadly, as many of you know, that's a question that's been a source of misunderstanding and even controversy at times among sincere, Bible-believing Christians. Therefore, we should approach this kindly and humbly, particularly between what are called Arminians. I don't even like to use that kind of language, but sometimes you have to use these terms as kind of shorthand. What are called Arminians and those who are called Calvinists. And those terms can sometimes be a bit misleading. but they really go back to shortly after the Reformation, and they're shorthand for the teachings of Jacob Arminius, who promoted ideas that were later condemned by the Synod of Dort around 1619.